It all began in a quiet classroom tucked away in an ordinary school, a place where learning and growth were supposed to flourish. The walls were decorated with colorful charts, inspirational quotes, and a world map that seemed to promise endless possibilities. But for one student, the promise of education felt more like a trap. He sat in the middle row, trying to stay invisible, hoping each day would pass without incident. His silence wasn't from a lack of intelligence, far from it. He was sharp, observant, and full of potential. But that potential was often overshadowed by something far beyond his control, the color of his skin. The teacher, a middle-aged man with a stern face and an intimidating presence, had a reputation for being tough. Some would call him old-fashioned, others would whisper that he was unfair. For this student, the whispers weren't necessary. He experienced it firsthand. The teacher's words, though cloaked in professionalism, often carried a sharp edge when directed his way. It wasn't just what he said but how he said it, the dismissive tone, the narrowed eyes, the way he'd sigh before calling his name as if it were a burden to even acknowledge him. On the surface, it might have seemed like a clash of personalities, a teacher pushing a student to excel. But those who paid closer attention, if they bothered to, could see it for what it really was. The subtle jabs, the unnecessary criticisms, the way praise always seemed to skip over his desk. It wasn't loud or obvious, it was quiet, calculated, and constant. And for a teenager trying to navigate school life, it felt like an unspoken battle he was destined to lose. One day, things took a sharper turn. It was during a class discussion, a lively debate about current events. The student, despite his efforts to stay out of the spotlight, made a thoughtful comment. His voice was steady, his points well articulated. For a moment, the class fell silent, impressed by his insight. But the teacher wasn't. Instead of acknowledging the merit of what was said, he let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Well, that's an interesting perspective," the teacher said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But maybe you should focus more on understanding the basics before diving into such deep waters." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. A few students exchanged glances, some looking down at their desks, others shifting in their seats. The boy clenched his fists under the table but kept his face neutral. He'd learned early on that reacting only gave them more to talk about. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it was one of the most public. And it wasn't just the comment itself, it was the way the teacher looked at him after, daring him to challenge it. The boy stared back for a moment, the wheels in his mind turning. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, waiting to see what he would do. But instead of arguing, he simply nodded and said, "I understand." His voice was calm, almost too calm. If the teacher thought he'd won, he was mistaken. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, the boy sat at his small desk at home, staring at a blank piece of paper. His mind replayed the events of the day, not just the humiliation in class but every slight, every look, every dismissive comment he'd endured. He thought about how easy it would be to let it go, to stay quiet, to keep his head down and survive until the end of the school year. But something in him refused to accept that. He was tired of surviving. He wanted to live. He wanted to be heard. And so, he began to write. It wasn't just a letter or a complaint. It was a reflection of everything he felt, everything he had experienced, and everything he believed needed to change, not just for himself but for every student who had ever felt the sting of prejudice, whether they recognized it or not. His words flowed with passion and precision, a perfect blend of intellect and emotion. By the time he was done, the paper was filled with sentences that didn't just speak, they shouted, demanded to be acknowledged. The next day, he walked into class with a quiet determination. He didn't flinch when the teacher looked his way, didn't lower his gaze when called upon. When the moment came, when the teacher made yet another cutting remark, the boy raised his hand, his voice steady as he asked, "May I say something?" What happened next would leave everyone in that classroom speechless. The teacher, the students, and even the boy himself would soon realize that this wasn't just a simple response. It was a moment that would change everything, a moment no one would forget. The classroom fell silent as the boy stood. It wasn't the kind of silence that followed the teacher's usual remarks, heavy with discomfort but fleeting. This was different. It carried a weight that even the teacher couldn't ignore. He paused, eyebrow raised, clearly caught off guard by the boy's sudden boldness. The student, normally so quiet and unassuming, had somehow shifted the energy in the room. The teacher crossed his arms, a faint smirk on his face as if to say, "Let's see what you've got." The boy didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. For a moment, he glanced around the room, catching the eyes of a few classmates. Some looked curious, others surprised, but a few held something else, something that felt like silent encouragement. "I've been thinking a lot about the things you've said to me," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Not just today, but over the past few months." The teacher's smirk faltered just slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Instead, he gestured for the boy to continue, as if humoring him. The boy didn't hesitate. "I know I'm not the only one who notices it," he said, glancing at his classmates again. "The way you talk to me. The way you look at me. It's different. And not because I'm different, not because I don't try or because I'm not capable. It's because of something I can't change. Something I shouldn't have to change." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, it seemed like no one dared to breathe. The teacher's smirk was gone now, replaced by a thin line of tension in his jaw. But still, he said nothing. Maybe he was waiting for the boy to stumble, to lose his train of thought. If so, he was going to be disappointed. "You're always telling us to think critically, to speak up, to ask questions," the boy continued. "But it seems like that only applies to some of us. For others, it's more about staying quiet, staying small, staying manageable." A murmur rippled through the classroom, barely audible but impossible to miss. The boy's words were hitting nerves, not just with the teacher but with everyone listening. He could feel it, could see the way some of his classmates shifted in their seats, their expressions betraying a mix of emotions: agreement, discomfort, maybe even guilt. But he wasn't finished. "I've tried to ignore it, to focus on the work, to not let it get to me," he said, his voice growing steadier with each word. "But ignoring it doesn't make it go away. And it doesn't make it right." The teacher finally spoke, his voice tight and measured. "Are you accusing me of something?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. The boy met his gaze head-on, unflinching. "I'm saying that words matter. How you treat people matters. And you've made it very clear how you see me." The tension in the room was palpable now, thick enough to cut with a knife. The teacher opened his mouth to respond, but the boy wasn't finished. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the paper he'd written the night before. It was slightly crumpled from being folded and refolded, but the words on it were clear and sharp. "I wrote something," he said, holding it up. "It's not just for you. It's for everyone in this room. Because this isn't just about me. It's about how we treat each other, about the kind of world we want to live in." The teacher stared at the paper, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might snatch it out of the boy's hands, tear it up, and end the conversation then and there. But he didn't. Maybe he was too stunned, or maybe he realized that doing so would only prove the boy's point. Whatever the reason, he stayed silent, his lips pressed into a thin line. The boy unfolded the paper and began to read. His voice was steady, but there was a rawness to it, a vulnerability that made every word land with undeniable force. He spoke about the pain of being dismissed, the frustration of being overlooked, the anger of feeling like you have to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good. He spoke about resilience, about the strength it takes to keep going in the face of constant doubt. And he spoke about hope that things could change, that people could change, that maybe, just maybe, his words could make a difference. By the time he finished, the classroom was completely still. No one whispered. No one moved. Even the teacher seemed momentarily lost for words. The boy folded the paper and placed it back in his backpack. He didn't expect applause or validation. That wasn't why he had spoken. He had done it because he needed to, because staying silent had become unbearable. The bell rang, shattering the heavy silence. Students began to gather their things, glancing at the boy as they filed out of the room. Some gave him small nods, others avoided his gaze, but no one said anything. The teacher stayed behind, watching as the boy packed up his books and slung his backpack over his shoulder. As he walked toward the door, the teacher called his name. The boy paused, turning to face him. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Then, the teacher said, "We'll talk tomorrow?" The boy didn't respond. He simply nodded and walked out of the room, his heart pounding but his head held high. He didn't know what would happen next. Maybe things would get worse before they got better. Maybe nothing would change at all. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in that classroom for months: pride. As he made his way down the hall, he noticed a few of his classmates watching him. One of them, a girl who had always seemed shy and withdrawn, gave him a small smile. Another, a boy who usually sat in the back of the room cracking jokes, raised a fist in quiet solidarity. The boy smiled back, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. He didn't know where this road would lead, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't walking it alone. And that was enough to keep him going. The walk home that day felt longer than usual. The boy's thoughts were a whirlwind, replaying everything that had happened in the classroom. He wasn't sure if he felt relieved or anxious. For months, he'd stayed quiet, endured the comments, and kept his frustrations to himself. Speaking out had felt like a release, but it also left him with questions he couldn't answer. Would the teacher retaliate? Would anything change? Did anyone else even care? When he got home, the house was quiet. His mom was still at work, pulling another late shift to make ends meet, and his younger sister was at a friend's house. He dropped his bag by the door and sank onto the couch, letting the silence wrap around him. He wanted to feel proud of himself for standing up, but the weight of uncertainty was hard to ignore. That evening, as he worked on his homework, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was from one of his classmates, someone he didn't know particularly well. The message was short but unexpected. "Hey, I just wanted to say what you said today was brave. You were right." He stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back a quick "thanks." It wasn't much, but it made him feel less alone, like maybe he'd planted a seed. The next day at school, the tension was tangible. As he walked into the classroom, he could feel the stares, the weight of whispered conversations behind him. Some students avoided eye contact, while others gave him subtle nods or small smiles. It was clear that his words had left an impression. The teacher, however, was harder to read. He stood at the front of the room, his usual stern expression in place. When the boy took his seat, the teacher's eyes lingered on him for just a moment longer than usual, but nothing was said. Class went on as if nothing had happened, but the boy could feel the undercurrent of something brewing. During lunch, a few classmates approached him. One of them, a girl who had always seemed confident and outspoken, sat down across from him. "What you said yesterday," she began, leaning in so her voice wouldn't carry. "It needed to be said. He's been like that for years. You're not the first." The boy frowned. "What do you mean?" She glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. "You're not the first person he's treated unfairly. It's just that most people don't say anything. They're too scared." "Why?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Because it's easier to stay quiet, she said, her voice softening. No one wants to risk their grades or get on his bad side. But what you did, it's making people talk. In a good way. The boy wasn't sure if her words made him feel better or worse. It was comforting to know he wasn't imagining things, that his experiences weren't isolated. But it was also infuriating to realize how long this had been happening, how many others had endured it in silence. As the days passed, the tension between him and the teacher became more apparent. The teacher's comments were sharper now, his tone colder. He didn't outright confront the boy, but the atmosphere in the classroom had shifted. The boy tried to stay focused, to keep his head up, but the weight of it all was exhausting. One afternoon, after yet another pointed remark during class, the boy decided he needed advice. He went to see one of the school's guidance counselors, a kind woman who always seemed to have time for her students. She listened as he explained everything: his experiences, his frustrations, and his fears about what might happen next. "I'm glad you came to me," she said when he finished. "It's not easy to stand up for yourself, especially in a situation like this. But I want you to know you're not alone. We take these kinds of concerns seriously." The boy wasn't sure if he believed her, but he nodded anyway. She promised to look into it, to speak with the teacher and the administration. He left her office feeling a mix of hope and skepticism. The following week, things took an unexpected turn. During a class discussion, another student, a boy who usually kept to himself, raised his hand and challenged something the teacher had said. It was subtle, just a small correction, but the teacher's reaction was swift and harsh. "That's incorrect," the teacher snapped. "Maybe if you paid more attention, you'd understand the material better." The boy watched as the student's face fell, the confidence draining from him. It was a familiar look, one the boy had worn himself more times than he could count. And in that moment, he realized something: this wasn't just about him. The teacher's behavior wasn't an isolated issue. It was a pattern. He started paying closer attention, not just to how the teacher treated him, but to how he interacted with the rest of the class. The favoritism was obvious, the bias even more so. Certain students were praised no matter what they said, while others were met with criticism, no matter how hard they tried. The boy began to document everything: the comments, the tone, the patterns he noticed. It wasn't out of spite or a desire for revenge. It was about making sure there was a record, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay. But as he delved deeper, he started to notice other things: too subtle interactions between students, quiet alliances forming. Some of his classmates began to speak up more, pushing back against the teacher's remarks in small but significant ways. Others stayed silent but offered quiet support through glances and nods. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was something. And for the first time, the boy began to feel like change was possible. Still, the tension was far from resolved. The teacher was clearly aware of the shift in dynamics, and his frustration was becoming harder to hide. One day, after class, he called the boy aside. "I hope you're not trying to start something here," he said, his tone low and dangerous. The boy met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I'm just trying to be treated fairly," he said simply. The teacher's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. As the boy walked away, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease. He didn't know what the teacher would do next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't backing down. The days following the teacher's warning felt heavier than ever. The boy could sense that something was about to give, though he couldn't tell when or how. The teacher's cold demeanor was now laced with something else: an edge of calculation, like he was waiting for the right moment to strike. The boy carried on as best he could, focusing on his work and keeping his head up, but the unease was impossible to ignore. The whispers around the school grew louder. Word had spread about what happened in the classroom that day, and students who had never paid him much attention were now watching him closely. Some seemed inspired, others wary, as if they weren't sure whether he was courageous or reckless. A few even approached him in the hallways, sharing their own experiences with the teacher's small, quiet moments of unfairness or disdain that had gone unspoken until now. It became clear that this wasn't just about one incident or one person. The teacher had left a trail of discontent behind him, and the boy's actions had stirred something in others. Still, knowing that others shared his frustration didn't make it easier. If anything, it made the weight of it all feel even greater. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had ever felt small, dismissed, or unwelcome in that classroom. Then, one morning, everything changed. It started like any other day. The boy walked into class, taking his usual seat near the middle of the room. The teacher was already at his desk, his eyes flicking briefly toward the boy before turning back to his papers. The air in the room was tense, the unspoken conflict between them hanging heavy over the space. About halfway through the lesson, the teacher made one of his usual sharp comments, this time directed at a girl who had dared to challenge an answer he'd given. The girl's face turned red, and she looked down at her desk, clearly embarrassed. The boy could feel the anger bubbling up inside him. He clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure, but something in him snapped. "Why do you always do that?" he said, his voice cutting through the silence. The room froze. All eyes turned toward him, the air suddenly electric with anticipation. The teacher looked up from his desk, his expression a mix of annoyance and disbelief. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You heard me," the boy said, his voice steady despite the knot of nerves in his stomach. "Why do you always tear people down when they're just trying to learn?" The teacher stood slowly, his gaze locked on the boy. "I think you're forgetting your place," he said. "No," the boy replied, meeting his gaze. "I think you're forgetting yours." A collective gasp rippled through the room. No one had ever spoken to the teacher like that before, and the tension was almost unbearable. The boy could feel his heart pounding, but he refused to back down. "You think you can get away with treating us like this because we're students," he continued. "Because we're younger, because we don't have the power to fight back. But that doesn't make it right. And it doesn't mean we're going to stay quiet." The teacher's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might explode, might unleash every ounce of his frustration on the boy in front of the entire class. But then, something unexpected happened. The girl who had been humiliated earlier raised her hand. "He's right," she said quietly. The teacher turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "What did you say?" "I said he's right," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "You treat some of us differently. You don't listen to us. You assume we're wrong before we've even finished speaking." Another student chimed in, this one from the back of the room. "Yeah, you do it to me too. And I'm tired of it." The boy looked around, his heart swelling as one by one, more students began to speak up. Their voices overlapped, each one sharing their own experiences, their own frustrations. The teacher tried to regain control, raising his voice to quiet them, but it was no use. The floodgates had opened, and there was no stopping it now. The boy felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the look on the teacher's face. He wasn't just angry, he was furious. The kind of fury that didn't just fade away. As the students' voices grew louder, the teacher slammed his hand on the desk, silencing the room instantly. "That's enough," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "I will not tolerate this kind of disrespect in my classroom." The students fell silent, their earlier courage suddenly giving way to fear. The teacher's gaze swept over them, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can challenge me?" he said, his voice cold and biting. "You think you know better than someone who's been doing this for years? Let me remind you who's in charge here." The boy met his gaze, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, waiting to see what he would do. "We know who's in charge," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean we don't deserve respect. And it doesn't mean we're going to stop speaking up." The teacher stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was so silent that the boy could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above them. Then, without a word, the teacher turned and walked out of the room, the door slamming shut behind him. The class sat in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. The boy felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a new kind of tension. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And whatever came next, he knew it wouldn't be easy. But as he looked around at his classmates, he saw something that gave him strength: unity. They weren't just individuals anymore, each struggling in silence. They were a group, a force, and together, they were stronger than he ever could have imagined. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. No one moved, no one spoke. The teacher's abrupt exit had left the air thick with unease, and for a moment, it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The boy sat frozen, his mind racing. Had they gone too far? Would there be consequences that none of them had foreseen? Just as the murmurs began to ripple through the room, the door creaked open again. Every head turned, expecting the teacher to return, his anger now fully unleashed. But instead, a different figure walked in, a senior administrator. Her presence was commanding, her gaze sweeping across the room with a quiet intensity that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "I've been made aware of some concerns regarding this classroom," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And I'd like to hear from you directly." The boy's stomach sank. This wasn't what he had expected. He had hoped for change, for justice, but now it felt like they were all under a microscope. The administrator's eyes landed on him first, and he could feel the weight of her attention. "Would you like to tell me what's been happening here?" she asked. He hesitated, his mind flashing through the events of the past weeks. He didn't want to sound like he was exaggerating or being petty. But at the same time, this was his chance, maybe their only chance, to make their voices heard. "It's not just one thing," he began carefully. "It's the way we're treated. The way he talks to us, like we're not worth his time. The way he assumes we're wrong before we've even had a chance to explain ourselves." The administrator nodded, her expression neutral but attentive. She turned to the rest of the class. "Is that how the rest of you feel as well?" One by one, hands began to go up. The girl who had spoken out earlier was the first to voice her agreement, followed by several others. Their stories varied, but the theme was the same: favoritism, dismissiveness, and a lack of respect that had left many of them feeling demoralized and defeated. The boy watched as his classmates found their voices, the room coming alive with shared experiences and long-suppressed frustrations. For the first time, it felt like they were truly being heard. But just as he began to feel a flicker of hope, the administrator held up a hand, signaling for silence. "I understand your concerns," she said. "But there's something you should know." Her tone had shifted, and the boy felt a chill run down his spine. The way she was looking at them now wasn't the same as before. There was something sharper, something guarded. "This isn't the first time these kinds of complaints have been brought up about your teacher," she continued. "But every time, we've investigated, and there hasn't been enough evidence to take action." The words hit the boy like a punch to the gut. Not enough evidence. It felt like a dismissal, a justification for inaction. He could see the frustration on his classmates' faces, the way their earlier courage was beginning to falter. "But," the administrator added, her voice softening, "that doesn't mean we're ignoring you. I need you all to trust me when I say that these things take time. There are processes we have to follow, and we need to be thorough." The boy clenched his fists under the desk. Time. Processes. It all sounded like a way to delay, to brush their concerns aside until they were forgotten. He didn't want to believe that, but the doubt was already creeping in. Before anyone could respond, the door opened again. This time, it was the teacher. He walked in slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the boy thought he looked almost calm. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made the boy's unease grow. "I see you've started without me," the teacher said, his tone measured but with an edge that was impossible to miss. The administrator turned to him, her posture stiffening. "I'm here to address some concerns that have been raised," she said. The teacher's gaze flicked to the boy, then to the rest of the class. "Concerns?" he repeated, his voice low. "Or accusations?" The room went still again. The boy could feel the tension radiating from his classmates, the way they all seemed to shrink back slightly in their seats. But he refused to look away, even as the teacher's eyes locked onto his. "What exactly have you been telling them?" the teacher asked, his voice directed squarely at the boy. "I told the truth," the boy said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. The teacher took a step closer, his gaze narrowing. "The truth, huh? Or just your version of it?" The boy's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. "It's not just me," he said, gesturing to his classmates. "It's all of us. We've all experienced it." The teacher's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he might lash out. But then he turned back to the administrator, his expression shifting into something almost smug. "You see what I deal with," he said, spreading his hands. "This is what happens when students think they know better than their teachers. They gang up, they make baseless claims, and they think they can run the classroom." The administrator didn't respond immediately. She looked at the teacher, then at the students, her expression carefully neutral. "I think it's clear that this situation requires further discussion," she said finally. "I'll be following up with all of you individually to get a clearer picture of what's been happening here." The boy could feel the disappointment in the room, the way his classmates deflated at her words. It wasn't the resolution they had hoped for, and it left an uneasy sense that nothing would change. As the administrator left, the teacher turned back to the class. His expression was calm again, but his eyes were sharp. "Let's get back to the lesson, shall we?" he said, his tone cold and clipped. The boy could feel his classmates' eyes on him, could sense their uncertainty. The momentum they had built earlier was slipping away, and he didn't know how to get it back. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The teacher's composure was just a mask, and underneath it, the tension was still simmering. Something was going to give, it was only a matter of time. And when it did, the boy knew he would have to be ready. The following day, the atmosphere in the classroom was different. There was a heavy silence as the students filtered in, each one glancing nervously at the teacher sitting at his desk. His expression was unreadable, his movements slow and deliberate as he arranged papers and adjusted his tie. The boy sat in his usual seat, his thoughts racing. Something about the way the teacher carried himself felt off, too calm, too measured. It was as though he was preparing for something. And the boy couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. As the lesson began, the teacher's tone was unusually pleasant, almost unnervingly so. He moved through the material with practiced ease, addressing the class with a forced politeness that made the students exchange uneasy glances. The boy watched him closely, trying to read between the lines, but there was nothing obvious to latch onto. Yet, the tension was palpable, an undercurrent that hummed beneath every word the teacher spoke. Then, midway through the period, the administrator returned. This time, she wasn't alone. Another man, taller and dressed in a sharp suit, followed her into the room. His presence commanded attention, and the air seemed to shift as he stepped forward and introduced himself as a representative from the district office. The boy felt his stomach tighten. Whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be ordinary. The district representative wasted no time. He addressed the class directly, explaining that he was there to conduct an impartial review of the complaints that had been raised. His tone was calm but authoritative, and he assured the students that their voices would be heard. Then he turned to the teacher, who was sitting stiffly at his desk. "I'll need you to step outside with me for a moment," the representative said, his words firm but courteous. The teacher hesitated, his jaw tightening as his eyes flicked to the administrator, who gave him a pointed nod. Slowly, the teacher rose from his chair and followed the representative out of the room. The door closed behind them with a soft but resounding click. The class erupted into whispers as soon as they were gone. The boy looked around, seeing the mix of hope and fear on his classmates' faces. He wanted to believe that this was it, that real change was finally coming, but he couldn't ignore the nagging doubt in the back of his mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if the teacher found a way to manipulate the situation and come out unscathed? Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The students waited, the tension in the room building with every second. Finally, the door opened again, and the teacher walked back in, followed by the representative and the administrator. The teacher's expression was blank, his movements deliberate as he returned to his desk and sat down without a word. The representative addressed the class once more, thanking them for their honesty and assuring them that their concerns would be taken seriously. But there was something about his tone, calm and measured, but not entirely reassuring, that left the boy feeling uneasy. As the representative and administrator left, the teacher remained seated, his gaze fixed on his desk. The students sat in silence, waiting for him to speak, but he didn't. Instead, he slowly looked up, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the boy. The boy felt a chill run down his spine as the teacher's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Shall we continue?" the teacher said, his voice low and steady. It was a simple question, but there was something in the way he said it that sent a ripple of unease through the class. The boy could see it in his classmates' faces, they were as unsettled as he was. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The teacher's demeanor remained calm and controlled, but there was a tension beneath the surface that the boy couldn't ignore. It was as though the teacher was waiting for the right moment to make his move. By the time the final bell rang, the boy was exhausted, his mind racing with unanswered questions. That evening, as he sat at home trying to focus on his homework, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from one of his classmates, accompanied by a link to a video. His heart sank as he clicked on it and saw the thumbnail, a blurry image of the classroom, with the teacher standing at the front of the room. He hit play, and his stomach turned as he realized what he was watching. The video was a recording of one of their earlier classes, taken secretly by a student. It showed the teacher berating the boy, his words sharp and cutting. The boy remembered the incident vividly. It had been one of the moments that had pushed him to finally speak out. But as the video played on, he noticed something strange. The teacher's words had been edited, spliced together to make him sound even more cruel and unreasonable than he had been in reality. The boy's phone buzzed again, this time with another message. It was from a different classmate, and it contained a screenshot of a social media post. The post claimed that the boy had been the one to record and leak the video, accusing him of trying to manipulate the situation for his own gain. The boy felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. This wasn't true, he hadn't recorded anything, let alone shared it. But the comments on the post were already piling up, with people debating the truth of the situation. He realized with a sinking feeling what was happening. The teacher wasn't going to let this go. He was fighting back, using underhanded tactics to undermine the boy's credibility and shift the narrative in his favor. The boy's heart pounded as he thought about what to do. He couldn't let this stand, but he also couldn't afford to play into the teacher's hands. This was a game of strategy now, and the stakes had never been higher. The next morning, the boy walked into school with a renewed sense of determination. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to back down. The truth was on his side, and he was willing to fight for it, no matter what it took. As he stepped into the classroom, he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The teacher looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," the teacher said, his tone deceptively pleasant. The boy met his gaze, his own expression calm but resolute. "Good morning," he replied, his voice steady. The battle wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The tension in the classroom lingered throughout the day, a silent battle brewing between the boy and the teacher. Every glance, every word exchanged carried an undertone of defiance and challenge. But the boy refused to let fear consume him. He wasn't alone anymore. His classmates, even the quieter ones who had hesitated before, were now beginning to stand behind him. It was subtle small nods, fleeting looks of support, but it gave him strength. By the afternoon, word of the edited video and the false accusations had spread beyond the classroom. Some students believed the claims, whispering in the hallways and avoiding the boy's gaze, while others defended him openly. It was chaotic, the kind of situation that could spiral out of control quickly. But the boy had a plan. After school, he approached the administrator's office. His heart pounded as he knocked on the door, but he reminded himself why he was doing this. When he was invited in, he found both the administrator and the district representative waiting for him. He explained everything: the video, the social media posts, the teacher's behavior after their meeting. He didn't exaggerate or downplay anything, choosing his words carefully to ensure they understood the seriousness of the situation. The administrator listened intently, her expression growing more concerned with every word. The district representative asked for proof, and the boy handed over his phone, showing them the messages and screenshots he had received. They assured him that they would look into it immediately, but he could see the frustration in their faces. This wasn't just a case of misconduct anymore, it was something deeper, something more insidious. The next few days were a blur. The school launched a formal investigation, interviewing students, reviewing footage, and tracing the origins of the social media posts. Meanwhile, the teacher continued to act as though nothing was wrong, though his calm demeanor began to crack under the pressure. He was more irritable, more prone to snapping at students, and it didn't go unnoticed. The boy tried to stay focused on his classes, but it wasn't easy. The weight of everything that had happened hung over him, and the uncertainty of what would come next gnawed at his resolve. But his classmates rallied around him, offering words of encouragement, and even small acts of kindness: a shared lunch, a reassuring pat on the back. It reminded him that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Then, one morning, the announcement came over the loudspeaker. The teacher had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The classroom erupted into murmurs as the substitute walked in, but the boy stayed quiet, processing what this meant. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. The school implemented new policies to ensure students felt safe reporting misconduct, and the administration started holding regular meetings to address concerns. The boy was asked to speak at one of these meetings, sharing his experiences and offering suggestions for improvement. It was nerve-wracking, standing in front of so many adults and peers, but he knew it was important. As he spoke, he realized just how far he had come. He wasn't the same person he had been at the beginning of the year: timid, unsure of himself, afraid to speak out. He had found his voice, and in doing so, he had helped others find theirs too. The investigation concluded with the teacher being dismissed from his position. The edited video and false accusations were traced back to a small group of people outside the school, possibly connected to the teacher, though nothing was definitively proven. The boy felt a mix of relief and sadness. He hadn't wanted things to end this way, but he knew it was necessary. In the aftermath, life slowly returned to normal. The boy focused on his studies, his friendships, and the small joys of everyday life. But he didn't forget what he had been through, nor did he take for granted the lessons he had learned. One day, as he was walking home, he saw a group of younger students huddled together, whispering excitedly. They looked up as he passed, their faces lighting up with recognition. "Hey," one of them called out, "you're the one who stood up to that teacher, right?" The boy stopped, surprised. He nodded, unsure of what to say. "You're really brave," another student said. "We heard what you did. It was awesome." The boy smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. "Thanks," he said simply. As he continued walking, he thought about how much had changed not just for him, but for the entire school. He didn't feel like a hero or anything special, he had just done what he thought was right. But knowing that his actions had made a difference, that they had inspired others, made everything he had endured worthwhile. The story didn't have a perfect ending. There were still challenges to face, still work to be done. But for the boy, it was enough to know that he had made a start. And as he looked toward the future, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time.